Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I'm joined immediately by my colleague and co-host, Larry Kudlow of CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the weekend. There are Republican primaries reporting in and Democratic primaries reporting in across the country: Arkansas, Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, Oregon, Pennsylvania. Larry, a very good evening to you. Mr. McConnell winning very easily in his challenge in Kentucky. You're watching Georgia. Why so, Larry?
Well, Georgia's a crowded race, but the two guys, Jack Kingston and Perdue, whatever his first name is, the businessman who's a taxer, I think that Kingston's the class of that field, and Perdue's spending a fortune, but I think that Kingston is the guy, and I think Kingston can win the general election in Georgia. And he's, limited government. He's a Tea Party guy before there was a Tea Party. I've known him a long time, and I think it's an important race, very important race. Right
now, 17% in, Kingston leading 31-29 for Perdue. There will be a runoff in this. Neither is going to gain the 50% necessary, so the field will clear out after tonight's race. Kentucky, Mr. McConnell, no serious challenge at all from Mr. Bevin on this. Are you surprised by that, Larry?
No, Bevin never had any credibility, and he did get some outside money. So did McConnell, for that matter. I mean, there's a theme here. We saw it last Tuesday. We're going to see it again tonight. Basically, this whole so-called civil war between the establishment Republicans, if you will, and the Tea Party Republicans is kind of a non-starter this year. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the establishment Republicans, like McConnell, were not caught off guard. They raised money and ran tough campaigns. That's, I think, very important. We saw that in Nebraska last week when Sass won his race against the Tea Party guy. But number two, and this is more important to me, there isn't much of an ideological, philosophical, political difference between these candidates. In other words, the so-called Republican establishment basically agrees with the Tea Party on Obamacare, for example, and lower spending, and the need for tax reform, and the need for less regulation. There just isn't that much daylight. And the other thing that's very important is that candidate selection this year is going to be much better. I mean, what happened in 2010, the GOP should have taken the Senate, but for some very, very poor candidates in places like Delaware and Nevada. And even in 2012, the GOP should have done better in the Senate. This year, all of the money people in Washington, for example, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce or Karl Rove's group, or for that matter, some of the Tea Party groups like David Koch's group, they want good candidates. And where there's a situation where the Tea Party person agrees essentially with the incumbent, they're not going to go for the Tea Party. They haven't gone for the Tea Party much this year at all. And that's one reason why I think the Republicans are going to pick up, John, at least 6 seats and carry the Senate.
Back to the beginning of the debate about what is to be done with the Great Recession of 2008-2009. We welcome James Pethokoukis, Jimmy Pethokoukis of the American Enterprise Institute, writing in comment about the new autobiography by Mr. Geithner, who was Secretary of the Treasury for the first term for the Obama administration. His new book, Stress Test: Reflections on Financial Crises, publishing most recently in The Week. And Jimmy, a good evening to you. I like very much, I believe the art term here is counterfactual. What if the Federal Reserve had bailed out Main Street and not Wall Street? In other words, cut taxes and paid for the shortfall in all the demands of our government by printing money. Have I said that correctly? And what would have happened, Jimmy? Anything different? Good evening to you.
Good evening. I think what we would have had, I think we would have had a stronger recovery. And to me, even more importantly, we would have begun to end the expectation of these big banks that when they get into trouble, they're going to be bailed out by government. That is a huge problem which has gone unresolved. Tim Geithner is very proud that they bailed out the banks. That's the Geithner way: bail, bail, bail. And we've averaged a financial crisis in this country about every 10 years or so for nearly the past 200 years. So I'm expecting that we'll have at some point down the line, we'll have another financial crisis. And expectation remains we're going to bail out the banks. I think that has got to end.
You know, Jimmy, of course, I've thought a lot about this in the last bunch of years. Did you see the movie Chinatown? You remember when Jack Nicholson is slapping Faye Dunaway about the other woman? Who is she? My daughter, slap. My sister, slap. My daughter, slap. My sister, slap. That's kind of my position on the bank bailout. I hate it. We had to do it. I hate it. We had to do it. I hate it. And here's the final one, and I know Tim Geithner very well. I just had lunch with him not too long ago. I think the risk-reward ratio was not good at that moment in time. And remember, it wasn't just the top 5 banks. It was how many banks? They probably get 250 or 300 banks got money. In other words, to me, the risks of not doing it were greater than the reward of letting them go bust. I look at it as a reward because I agree with you. I don't like the moral hazard. I don't like bailing out too big to fail. I just think at that moment, I don't know what else they could have done. What you're saying later on, policy-wise, we should have cut tax rates, and you're right about that. But of course, Obama was elected president.
Well, let me say this: is I think Tim Geithner, I think a lot of people have it wrong. They think we had this financial crisis, and then it caused this Great Recession. It's really the other way around. We had a collapsing economy that, for the most part, caused a financial crisis. And if we could have stemmed that decline in the economy, which was already falling off a cliff before Lehman Brothers, I think we could have avoided that financial crisis. That's one of the things I wanted to do. Now, with that being said, my goal is to create a banking system that is going to be sort of stress-proof, going to be far more resilient, and I think one way we do that is by making them hold a lot more capital. We had Gene Fama, Nobel Prize-winning economist, speak at a big AI dinner not so long ago, and he wanted to see dramatically higher capital levels for banks, which I also think would be a fantastic idea, so we don't end up in this situation again.
Yeah, I like the capital idea. I like that a lot. I also think that I agree with you about the collapsing economy, but I want to bring into the conversation John Taylor's point of view. You know John. Mm-hmm. And of course, John Batchelor has him as a guest, as I do. Taylor makes the argument, Jimmy, that during that crisis when credit markets froze, the whole repurchase market, over $20 trillion worth, the interbank overnight market stopped. Okay, so banks literally could not fund their position. J.P. Morgan wouldn't loan to Citibank. That's how we look at it. So Taylor says that you let Lehman Brothers go down, but you bailed out AIG, and you bailed out Fannie and Freddie. So therefore, nobody in the financial world could figure out the government's next move. In other words, the uncertainty was so large that everything froze up. And I often wonder whether Taylor isn't right. The government, and this includes Hank Paulson, the outgoing Republican Treasury Secretary, Bush's man, they didn't have a policy. They were doing it on the fly, and no one could figure out what their next move was. And I think that had a lot to do with freezing the system.
Well, I think you may be right, and let me just also toss in the fact that even as the economy was sinking fast, between April 2008 and I believe September 2008, not only did the Fed do nothing, but if you look at the futures markets, they were actually expecting a tightening of Fed policy, because when the various Fed governors are going out and talking, they're being very hawkish. They're very worried about inflation. So you actually had a de facto tightening of monetary policy in 2008 when they should have been cutting like mad as the economy is dropping off a cliff in 2008. So about everything that could go wrong did. And I don't think Lehman Brothers was a fait accompli that we had to get to that point, but we did get to that point. My concern is that we'll get to that point again in the future.
James Pethokoukis of AEI, Larry Kudlow of CNBC, and Kudlow Radio on the Weekend. When we come back, we're going to move from the counterfactual of 2008-2009 to the very challenging policy problem for the Republican Party in 2014, immigration. Larry's got thoughts about immigration as pro-growth. James Pethokoukis, I'm John Batchelor.